The forbidden secret. Obinna had always known hardship. Growing up in the small, quiet village of Umuahia, he witnessed the struggle of his parents and neighbors. His father worked tirelessly in the fields, only to return home exhausted with little to show for it. His mother, though kind and loving, spent long hours preparing food and caring for the children. Obinna had dreams of breaking free from this life, of becoming someone powerful, someone who could give his family a better life. But with each passing day, he felt trapped in the same routine, caught in a cycle of poverty that seemed impossible to escape. He worked hard, day in and day out, taking on whatever job he could find, whether it was helping the farmers in the field, working as a laborer in the nearby town, or fixing tools for the elders. But no matter how much effort he put in, he never seemed to catch a break. His dreams of wealth and success seemed as distant as the stars in the sky. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the village, Obinna sat by the fire, his mind heavy with thoughts of his struggles. The sound of murmuring voices from the elders gathered under the big tree caught his attention. The elders were the wise ones in the village, the keepers of ancient knowledge and tradition. Obinna had always respected them, though he never fully understood their ways. He had been taught to keep his distance, but tonight, their whispers seemed different, urgent and mysterious. "Do you think he's ready?" an old voice asked. "He is the one," another replied. "But the price is steep. No man should meddle with the spirits unless he is prepared to pay the cost." Obinna's curiosity piqued. He had never heard talk of a price being paid, nor had he ever heard such serious tones from the elders. His heart beat faster as he leaned in closer, trying to catch every word. "I've heard of it," the first elder whispered. "The ritual, it brings great wealth, but at a terrible price. Those who seek it often lose more than they gain. Who among us would dare? This secret has been kept for generations." "It is not for the weak-hearted," the second elder replied, his voice tinged with fear. Obinna's mind raced. Great wealth. At a price? He could barely comprehend what they were talking about, but the thought of escaping his struggles, of finally providing for his family, filled him with a burning desire. That night, sleep eluded him. His thoughts were consumed by the whispers of the elders. The opportunity of a lifetime. The chance to change everything. All he had to do was find the one who knew the ritual, Dibiankem. Dibiankem was a figure of mystery in Umuahia. An old spiritualist who lived alone in the forest at the edge of the village. She was feared and revered. People whispered that she had powers beyond comprehension, that she could speak to the spirits and unlock the secrets of the universe. But she was also said to be dangerous, unpredictable, and would not hesitate to punish those who sought her help for selfish reasons. Obinna's mind was made up. His hunger for success overshadowed any fear of the unknown. The next morning, he set off before dawn, making his way through the dense forest to find Dibiankem. When he arrived at the small hut hidden among the trees, the air was thick with an eerie silence. The old woman stood at the door, her eyes sharp and knowing. She had been expecting him. "I've heard what you seek, young man," Dibiankem said, her voice like a soft breeze through the leaves. "It is a dangerous path you wish to walk." Obinna's heart raced, but he pressed on. "I am desperate. My family needs me. Please, show me the way. I'll do anything." The Dibia's eyes softened for a moment, as though she saw something within him that made her hesitate. But then, her expression hardened. "Do not be fooled by your greed, Obinna. The ritual comes with a cost. You may gain wealth, but the consequences will follow you for the rest of your life. It is not something to be taken lightly." Obinna clenched his fist. He had nothing left to lose. His pride, his ambition, they were too great to ignore now. "I understand," he said, though in his heart, he didn't. "I am ready." The Dibia sighed, and with a heavy heart, she led him inside. The air was thick with incense and the scent of ancient herbs. Candles flickered in the corners, casting long shadows against the walls. She began preparing the ritual, chanting words in a language Obinna couldn't understand, her hands moving with practiced precision. The moment the ritual was complete, a strange energy filled the air. Obinna felt a surge of power, a wave of something overwhelming and intoxicating. He stood there, motionless, as the world around him seemed to shift. That night, as he returned to the village, he could feel it, the change. His heart raced with anticipation. He had done it. His fortune was about to change. The next day, Obinna found an unexpected gift waiting for him. A sack of gold coins appeared at his doorstep, shining in the morning light. And soon after, opportunities flooded in. Business deals, lucrative jobs, and a wealth he had only dreamed of began to materialize out of thin air. But Obinna, intoxicated by his newfound success, had no idea that the price for the wealth he had so eagerly sought was just beginning to reveal itself. The consequences of the ritual had already begun to take root, the rise of Obinna. Obinna's life was no longer the same. The wealth that had arrived so suddenly, like a river breaking free from its banks, flooded every corner of his existence. He was no longer the poor, struggling man from the village. He had become someone else, someone with power, influence, and resources beyond his wildest dreams. The business deals flowed effortlessly. Contracts for building projects, trade deals with merchants from the city, and even lucrative partnerships with wealthy men from neighboring towns, everything he touched seemed to turn to gold. His name spread far and wide, and soon, people were coming to him for favors, advice, and assistance. Obinna's wealth multiplied beyond his imagination, and with each passing day, he felt himself growing more and more invincible. Soon, the modest house where he had grown up became a thing of the past. Obinna's mansion rose from the ground, towering over the other homes in the village. It was a sprawling structure made of stone and wood, with intricate carvings on the walls and beautiful gardens that stretched for acres. It was the envy of everyone in Umuahia, a symbol of his new power. His family, once humble, struggling to get by, had now become the talk of the village. His wife, Edeora, who had once worried over how to feed their children, now wore the finest clothes and jewelry. Their children were enrolled in the best schools, and Obinna made sure they wanted for nothing. His younger brother, who had once shared in his struggles, was now a manager in one of Obinna's businesses. The entire family was elevated, adored by those who once looked down on them. The respect Obinna commanded in the village was unparalleled. The elders, who had once warned him of the dangers of greed, now came to him for guidance. Even the village chief, an imposing figure, sought his counsel. People greeted him with reverence, and he held lavish feasts, where the finest food and drink were served, and guests bowed in gratitude for his generosity. But in the midst of all this glory, something strange began to happen. At night, Obinna would often wake up, drenched in sweat, as though he had been running through the forest in the dark. Shadows flickered at the corners of his vision, creeping along the walls like sentient beings. He would turn quickly, but they were always gone by the time he could focus. He could hear soft whispers at night, like distant voices calling to him from the beyond. The sounds were unsettling, like a language he couldn't understand, yet something deep inside him made him feel that the voices knew him. They were familiar, as if they had always been there. At times, when Obinna would walk past a mirror, his reflection would act differently from him. His image would pause a moment longer than he did, or make an odd, unsettling motion, like it had a life of its own. It unnerved him, but he brushed it off, attributing it to his imagination or exhaustion from the constant walk. Edeora, too, began to notice the changes in her husband. He had once been kind and loving, always making time for her and their children despite his busy work. But now, He was distant, cold, and preoccupied. She would call his name, and he wouldn't respond, lost in thoughts of his latest business venture. He no longer smiled like he used to, and when they were alone, he seemed more like a stranger than the man she had married. One evening, as Obinna sat alone in the dimly lit parlor, Edeora approached him, her face etched with concern. She had tried to ignore the growing tension between them, but it had become impossible to ignore now. "Obinna," she said softly, sitting beside him. "What is happening to us? You're not the same man I married. You've changed, and not in a good way." Obinna didn't look at her. He stared out the window at the sprawling estate, his eyes distant. "I've given you everything you could ever want," he said, his voice colder than she remembered. "Isn't that enough?" Edeora reached for his hand, but he pulled away slightly, as if her touch was foreign to him. His gaze turned sharp, almost angry. "What more do you want, Edeora? I've worked hard for this life. I've earned it. You should be grateful." Tears welled up in Edeora's eyes, and she tried to hide them behind a smile. "I don't want things, Obinna. I want you. The man who used to love me. The man who used to care." But Obinna was no longer listening. He had become consumed by his wealth, his ambition, and the strange power that seemed to grow within him. The whispers, the shadows, the odd reflections, they all seemed to call him, urging him to seek even more. To never stop. To push forward no matter the cost. Edeora stood up, her heart heavy with the realization that she had lost him. "I don't know you anymore," she whispered, before turning away and leaving the room. As she walked down the long hallway of their mansion, Obinna remained seated, staring out the window, his mind consumed by thoughts of his wealth and what it could bring. The consequences of the ritual that had given him everything were beginning to reveal themselves in strange, subtle ways, but Obinna refused to acknowledge them. He believed his success was worth any price. What he didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that the cost of his newfound wealth was far greater than he had imagined. The shadows that followed him, the whispers that echoed in his ears, were not mere figments of his imagination. They were the spirits, the very forces he had bargained with in his desperate quest for power. And they had come to collect their due, the price of wealth. Obinna's life, once filled with excitement and the promise of a brighter future, had begun to take a darker turn. At first, it was subtle, the occasional shiver down his spine, a fleeting sense of dread in the pit of his stomach. But soon, the horrors became impossible to ignore. Night after night, Obinna was haunted by terrifying nightmares. In his sleep, he would find himself surrounded by faceless spirits, their bodies cloaked in shadow, their voices a soft murmur that became louder and more insistent. They would whisper his name, their words unintelligible but filled with an unmistakable sense of malice. He would wake up, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, only to find that the nightmares didn't fade with the morning light. The feeling lingered, like the spirits were still there, waiting, just out of sight. The whispers followed him during the day, too. He would be walking through his mansion, and suddenly, the voice would drift into his ears, soft and urgent. "Obinna. Obinna," he would hear, though no one was around. The voices seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once, sometimes faint, sometimes so clear that it felt as though someone was standing right beside him. But when he turned to look, there was no one there. He tried to ignore it. Tried to convince himself it was all in his head. But deep down, he knew the truth. The ritual, the one that had promised him wealth beyond measure, had come at a cost, and that cost was now being paid in full. One afternoon, as Obinna sat in his study, his trusted friend Chijioke came to visit. Chijioke had always been the voice of reason in Obinna's life, the one who reminded him of their humble beginnings and the importance of staying grounded. He had noticed the change in Obinna, the growing distance between them, and the strange events that seemed to follow him wherever he went. "Obinna," Chijioke said, sitting down across from him, his face serious. I've been hearing things. There are rumors about you, strange things. People say you've gone down a dangerous path. I need to warn you about something. Obinna looked up, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. What are you talking about, Chijioke? I've done what I had to do. I'm providing for my family now. I'm giving them everything they need. I know, Obinna, Chijioke said, his voice low and filled with concern. But I've heard the elders speak of the abandoned souls, the spirits that seek repayment from those who use the forbidden ritual. They are vengeful, and they do not forget. Obinna's heart skipped a beat. The name sent a chill down his spine. He had heard whispers of the abandoned souls, but he had always dismissed them as mere superstition, stories passed down by old men to frighten the young. But now, with the whispers and shadows closing in around him, the fear began to seep into his bones. You're saying that I've angered them? Obinna asked, his voice tight with unease. Chijioke nodded grimly. The legends say that once the ritual is done, the spirits will come to claim what they are owed. No one who has ever used the ritual has escaped their wrath. You've been marked, Obinna. And they will not stop until they take what is theirs. Obinna's mind raced. His heart pounded in his chest, but his pride, his greed, still held sway over him. I won't let them take what I've worked for, he said, more to himself than to Chijioke. I've earned this. They can't take it from me. But Chijioke's words haunted him. As the days went by, the strange occurrences grew worse. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. Obinna found it harder and harder to sleep. He would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of something pressing down on him. And then, one day, something happened that shook him to his core. His firstborn son, Kin, fell gravely ill. It started subtly, a slight fever, a cough. But within hours, Kin's condition worsened. The fever raged, and his body became weak. Obinna rushed to the best doctors in the village, but no medicine seemed to work. The healers were baffled, offering only helpless advice. The fever refused to break, and Kin's condition grew more dire with each passing hour. Obinna's world shattered. He had done everything for this family, his wife, his children, yet now, his son lay in agony, and he was powerless to help. He called for the best herbalist, the strongest potions, but nothing worked. Kin's eyes were glassy, his breathing shallow, and Obinna could see the life slowly draining from him. In the midst of this chaos, a figure appeared uninvited, Nigerian. She came to their home late one evening, just as Obinna sat beside his son's bed, watching him struggle for breath. Her presence was like a shadow that crept into the room, and her eyes held a knowing look, as if she had been expecting this moment. The spirits have come to collect, she said, her voice low and steady, like the murmur of an ancient wind. They do not forgive, Obinna. The price has been paid. Run if you wish, but you cannot hide. Obinna stared at her, the words chilling him to the bone. What do you mean? This is not what I wanted. I've given everything, my family, my success. I'm not the same man I was. Nigerian's expression softened, but there was no sympathy in her eyes. You asked for wealth, but you forgot the cost. The spirits will not be satisfied until they have what they are owed. As Obinna stood there, frozen in fear, Kin's breathing grew even weaker. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners deepening, as though something was moving just out of reach. You have brought this upon yourself, Obinna, Nigerian continued. Now, you must face the consequences. With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Obinna standing at his son's side, the weight of her words sinking in like a stone in his chest. The spirits were here. And they would not stop until they had claimed their due. The haunting begins. The once grand mansion that Obinna had built with his newfound wealth now felt like a prison, a place where the walls seemed to close in on him with each passing day. What had once been a symbol of success, of power, had become a place of horror. The wealth that had brought him to such heights now weighed heavily on his soul, and the spirits that he had unknowingly angered were taking their toll. At night, the house was alive with strange sounds. Doors would slam shut with a force that rattled the walls, even when there was no wind. Furniture would shift on its own, scraping across the floor as if some unseen hand was moving it. Eerie laughter would echo through the hallways, a laughter that sent a chill down the spines of anyone who heard it. But it wasn't just the sounds, it was the feeling, the oppressive weight that filled the air. It was as though the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. Obinna tried to dismiss the strange occurrences as figments of his imagination, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. His once loyal servants, who had praised him for his generosity, now fled the house in terror, too afraid to stay a moment longer. They spoke of things they couldn't explain, whispers in the dark, cold drafts that seemed to have no source, and the feeling of being watched by something not of this world. His wife, Edeora, was the first to see the apparitions. She had been awake one night, sitting by Kin's bedside, watching over her son as he slept. She had been praying silently, hoping for a miracle, when she noticed something moving in the shadows. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, perhaps the dim light playing tricks on her. But then, she saw it again. A figure, tall and dark, with no face, just a void of blackness where its features should have been. It stood at the foot of Kin's bed, watching them, its presence suffocating. Edeora froze, unable to move, her heart pounding in her chest. When she finally gathered the strength to call out to Obinna, the figure disappeared, leaving nothing but the cold air and the sense that something had been there, lacking. The children, too, began to see things. Little Nina, Obinna's youngest daughter, would cry out in fear at night, saying that a woman in a white dress was standing at the window, staring in. She would hide under her blankets, trembling with terror, refusing to sleep alone. Obinna tried to comfort her, but he could see the fear in her eyes. His own children, once filled with laughter and joy, had become shadows of themselves, quiet, withdrawn, and fearful of the house they once loved. One night, as Obinna walked through the mansion, a sudden, gut-wrenching realization struck him. The house, his beautiful, grand mansion, had become a place of dread. The walls seemed to pulse with the energy of something evil, and the air was thick with an unspoken tension. It was as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart, and the spirits that haunted him were drawing closer. But the worst was yet to come. In the dead of night, as the winds howled outside, a scream pierced the silence. Obinna rushed to Kin's room, only to find it empty. His son, his firstborn, was gone. The bed was untouched, the covers still perfectly arranged, but there was no sign of Kin. Panicked, Obinna searched every room in the house, calling his son's name, but there was no response. His heart raced as he ran from room to room, but it was as if Kin had vanished into thin air. And then, in the quiet, dim light of the hallway, Obinna saw something, a trail of black footprints, each one larger than the last, leading out of the room and down the long corridor. The footprints were unlike anything Obinna had ever seen. They were dark, unnaturally dark, and they seemed to ooze a thick, inky substance that left a stain on the floor with each step. Obinna followed the trail, his breath coming in shallow gasps, as the footprints led him outside, into the dark forest that bordered the mansion. The cold night air beat at his skin, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. His son was out there, somewhere, in the grip of whatever had taken him. The footprints led deep into the woods, but as Obinna reached the edge of the trees, he found that they abruptly stopped. There was no sign of Kin. No trace of him. The only thing that remained was the emptiness of the forest and the cold, unsettling silence. Desperate, Obinna returned to the house, his mind racing with fear and confusion. What was happening? Where was his son? And what had caused the trail of black footprints to appear in the first place? Unable to ignore the growing sense of doom that weighed on him, Obinna knew what he had to do. He had to find Dibiankem. He needed answers. He needed a way to undo the curse that had gripped his family, to reclaim the life he had destroyed with his greed. That night, as the moon rose high in the sky, Obinna made his way to the Dibia's home. The journey was long, the path dark and treacherous, but he didn't care. He would face whatever he had to, as long as it meant saving his son. When he finally arrived, he found Dibiankem waiting for him, her eyes steady and calm, as though she had been expecting him all along. "I've come to beg you," Obinna said, his voice strained with desperation. "Please, tell me how to undo the curse. I can't lose my son. I can't live with this horror any longer." The Dibia regarded him silently for a moment before speaking. "To undo the ritual," she said, her voice as cold as the wind, "you must return everything you have taken. All the wealth, all the power, all that you gained through the ritual, it must be returned. Only then will the spirits be satisfied. Or you will face the unthinkable." Obinna's blood ran cold. The unthinkable. The very words sent a chill through him. "Return everything," he repeated, disbelief and fear lacing his voice. How can I give back what I've worked so hard for?" Dibiankem's gaze was unwavering. "You cannot undo what you have done without paying the price. You wanted wealth, you wanted power. But now, you must return it all. The spirits demand balance, and you must give back what you took, everything." Obinna stood in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always known there was a price for what he had done, but he had never truly understood the cost. Now, he did. And it was a price far greater than he had ever imagined. The trail of black footprints, the disappearance of his son, the haunting presence in the house, they were just the beginning. If he did not act soon, the spirits would claim more than just his wealth. They would take everything. And Obinna had no idea if he could ever make things right again. The descent into darkness. Obinna's world had been reduced to chaos and despair. The mansion, once a symbol of his success, had become his prison, and the price of his wealth now pressed on him with an unbearable weight. The spirits, who had once lurked in the shadows, now came out in full force, haunting every corner of his existence. But despite everything, despite the haunting, the terror, and the loss, Obinna refused to give up what he had gained. He had built his empire from the ground up. He had worked for years, struggling in poverty, to reach the heights he now stood upon. His wealth, his mansion, the respect he commanded, these were his rewards, his victory. He couldn't just throw it all away, not after everything he had sacrificed to get here. But the spirits were relentless, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore them, they were always there. At night, their whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were speaking directly into his mind. During the day, they appeared more openly, figures in the corners of his vision, shadows that twisted unnaturally, faces without features that stared at him from the mirrors. The once peaceful house had become a war zone, a battleground between Obinna's desire to hold onto his riches and the spirits that demanded their due. One night, as the whispers echoed in his mind, Obinna made a desperate decision. He would leave. He would take his family and flee the village. Surely, if they could get far enough away, the spirits would stop chasing them. If they left the place where the ritual had been performed, the horrors would cease. With his wife, Edeora, and their remaining children, Obinna packed what little they could carry and set off into the night. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the road as they walked in silence. But as they reached the edge of the village, something strange happened. They couldn't move. Obinna felt it first, a pressure in the air, a force that seemed to push against him. He tried to step forward, but his legs refused to move. Edeora and the children, too, stood still as though an invisible barrier had surrounded them, trapping them in place. "Obinna," Edeora whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "What is happening? We can't go anywhere. We are stuck." Obinna's heart pounded in his chest as he turned in circles, trying to find an escape. But no matter which way he faced, he was held in place, unable to move. It was as though the very earth beneath him was rejecting his attempts to flee. The spirit had placed a binding on him. There was no running, no escaping the consequences of his greed. "Go back," a voice whispered, so close to his ear that he jumped. He looked around, but there was no one there. "You cannot escape." The voice was cold, filled with the finality of a death sentence. Obinna's mind raced. He had made a terrible mistake, and now, there was no escape from it. The realization hit him with crushing force. He could never outrun the spirits. They would follow him, no matter where he went. There was no hiding from them. He fell to his knees, overwhelmed by despair, his family standing frozen around him. And then, one by one, they began to disappear. Edeora was the first to go. One moment, she was standing beside him, her face pale with fear, and the next, she simply vanished, her body dissolving into the air like mist. Her scream echoed in his ears for a moment, but then it was gone, replaced by the silence of the night. His children followed soon after. Kin, Nina, and the others, each one disappeared without a trace, as though they had never existed at all. The trail of black footprints that had once marked Kin's disappearance now seemed to surround him, leading nowhere, taunting him with the unspoken truth that he had lost everything. Alone and broken, Obinna collapsed to the ground, his mind unraveling in the darkness. He had nothing left. No wealth, no family, no future. His greed had cost him everything, and now he was paying the price in full. In the stillness of the night, he heard the whispers again, but this time, they were clearer, more distinct. The spirit spoke of his fate, revealing the truth that he had tried so hard to deny. "Obinna," the voices said, their tone cold and unforgiving. "You have taken from us what was never yours to take. Now, you will pay the price. You will never know peace again. Your soul will wander, cursed, for all eternity." The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. There was no redemption. No way to undo the damage he had done. The ritual, the wealth, the power, it had all come with a price that was far greater than he could ever have imagined. He had lost his family. He had lost his humanity. And now, he would lose his very soul. With no hope left, Obinna finally made the decision he had been avoiding, the one that had led him to this moment. He would return to the place where it all began. He would return to the ritual site, to the spot where he had first made the deal with the spirits. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make things right. But deep down, he knew it was already too late. The spirits had already claimed their payment, and there was no turning back. Obinna stood and began walking, guided by the black footprints that seemed to lead him back to his fate. The wind howled around him, carrying the whispers of the spirits, and he knew, no matter how far he walked, he would never escape their grasp. The descent into darkness had begun, and there was no escape from it. The final price. The night was as dark as Obinna's soul, the air thick with a foreboding stillness. He stood before the sacred shrine, the place where his fate had been sealed, and where the spirits that had once been his unseen tormentors now waited for him, their presence heavy in the air. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath, the wind no longer whispering, as if even nature itself was afraid to intrude upon this moment. Obinna fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he clasped them together in desperate prayer. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking with fear and regret. "Please, I beg you, spirit of the shrine, show mercy. I have lost everything, my family, my wealth, my peace. Please, spare me from what is to come. But the spirits did not answer him with compassion. Instead, they answered with silence, followed by the horrifying sound of footsteps echoing, endless, from the darkness. It was as if the very ground beneath him was trembling in anticipation. Slowly, the figures began to materialize around him, their ghastly forms rising from the shadows. Faces without eyes, skin stretched thin over bones, eyes burning with a haunting fire. These were not just spirits, they were the souls of those who had come before him, who had sought the same forbidden ritual, only to be claimed by the price that followed. Obina's breath caught in his throat as he saw the twisted faces of the long dead, the former seekers of fortune who had not been able to escape the spirit's wrath. Their eyes were empty of hope, their bodies wasted and decayed, trapped in a state between life and death. They surrounded him, their hollow eyes boring into his very soul. "You were warned," a voice boomed, deep and distorted, reverberating through Obina's chest. The voice belonged to one of the spirits, its form too twisted to recognize. "You took what was not yours, and now you will join us. You cannot escape the consequences of your greed." Obina's mind swirled with panic, his thoughts fragmented by the terror that gripped him. He could feel the weight of the spirits closing in on him, their ethereal hands reaching out, pulling him closer to the very void they inhabited. His heart raced, his pulse quickening with the realization that his time had come. "Please," he begged again, his voice a broken whisper. "Give me a chance to make things right. I will return everything, my wealth, my power, anything you want. Just spare me." But the spirits remained silent for a moment, and then the voice returned, colder and more final than before. "You were given a chance, Obina," it said. "Now you must choose. Return to the dust from which you came, and your suffering will end. Or, become one of us, trapped for eternity." Obina trembled, his chest tightening with fear as he looked into the faces of the spirits, those who had failed to pay the price before him. They were trapped, condemned to wander in darkness, forever bound by the ritual they had chosen. The ground seemed to shift beneath him, pulling him closer to the shrine as if the earth itself was demanding his soul. His entire body screamed in terror, but he could not move. He was paralyzed, caught in a web of his own making. The spirits reached out toward him, their hands cold as death itself. He could feel their fingers brush against his skin, dragging him toward the abyss, and the finality of their touch sent a surge of panic through him. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. "Obina," the voice intoned again. "You sought fortune, but you did not see the price. Now, you will join us." And with that, Obina was pulled into the darkness. The last thing he saw was the light of the moon, casting a pale glow over the shrine, before he was swallowed whole by the shadows. The next morning, the villagers woke to an eerie silence. The sun rose over the village, but there was no sign of Obina, no sign of his family. His mansion, once the pride of the village, stood abandoned. The doors were wide open, and inside, the once grand hallways were empty, save for dust and decay. The furniture, the treasures, the wealth that Obina had accumulated, it was all gone, reduced to mere ashes, as if the very earth had reclaimed it. The villagers gathered at the edge of the mansion, their eyes wide with disbelief. They spoke in hushed tones, trying to understand what had happened, but the only answer was the absence of Obina and his family. His riches had turned to dust, as if they had never existed at all. And then, the elders of the village, those who had known the old stories and the ancient truths, gathered the young ones around. Their faces were grave, their voices low, but filled with wisdom. "Obina's tale is a warning," one of the elders said. "Fortune from the spirits is never free. It comes with a price, one that must be paid in full. Those who seek wealth through dark paths will always find themselves lost in the end." Never forget the price of greed. And with that, the villagers left the mansion behind, and the stories of Obina's rise and fall would be passed down through the generations. His name would be remembered as a cautionary tale. A reminder of the darkness that lurks behind the search for power and wealth, and the price that must be paid when the spirits come to collect. Obina's mansion stood in silence, abandoned and forgotten, a monument to the dangers of greed, and a place where his soul would remain, lost forever to the darkness he had invited into his life.